Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's roundtable on the global and global political thought. My name is Ning Chang. I'm a doctoral student in political theory at Harvard's Department of Government and a co-organizer of the Association for Global Political Thought. I am so pleased to welcome you all today to the opening session for our spring seminar series. There is quite a bit to get through by way of introductions, so I will spare you my usual introduction to our project, except to say that we would so love to see you again at the rest of the sessions we have lined up for the semester. I will now put the link to the rest of our sessions in the chat so that you can visit it in your own time. I hope you'll join us in our upcoming discussions, which will feature topics such as race, religion, global Blackness, China's neoliberal economics, gender, feminism, and many, many more. So it is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. Professor Shruti Kapila is Associate Professor of Indian History and Global Political Thought at the University of Cambridge, where, among many other illustrious things, she teaches and trains students in the study of modern and contemporary India and global political thought. Professor Kapila's work and career has been an inspiration for the Association for Global Political Thought, and her recently published book, Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, served as the subject of our very first seminar session last fall. We are thrilled to welcome her back to the seminar, and we look forward to her comments on today's roundtable. Professor David Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History at Harvard, and again, a source of inspiration and greatly appreciated advising on the project. His contributions to the making of global intellectual history are many and varied, and we were honored last fall to also host a seminar session on a piece he had been writing on the ideas of George III as a study in a global microhistory of ideas. Professor Armitage's next book will be a global history of treaties over the longue durée, and we are very excited to hear his remarks on the question of global political thought. And finally, we are just as pleased and honored to welcome Professor Joshua Simon to the seminar series. Professor Simon is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, where he works at the intersection between political theory and comparative politics. His wonderful book, The Ideology of Creole Revolution, Imperialism and Independence in American and Latin American Political Thought, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, and it bears out so many of the exciting developments in the field's reconsideration of theory, method, and more. His ongoing work continues to shed light on the political ideas of Latin America, focusing specifically on efforts to build regional and hemispheric legal orders and political institutions in the Americas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A warm welcome to the session to all our guest speakers, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We will be inviting our speakers to each speak for a few minutes on the question at hand today: what is the global in global political thought? We will then ask the speakers to respond to one another. And then finally, we will stop the recording and open the floor up to discussion, whereupon I will give the usual reminders about the chat, digital hands, and so on. So Professor Kapila, would you like to start us off with your thoughts and comments on global political thought?
Well, thank you very much, Yining, and also to Hansong Lee for this very generous second invitation, and also for rearranging the time. A huge thank you to you and your amazing initiative. I think it's the way forward. A huge thank you and a great privilege to be in conversation with David, because not only has he been a friend, but I think I don't lie when I say that he has done more than most to enable the globalization of political thought and the study in its sort of wider form. So greetings from Delhi if I'm in the sort of dark corner, because I'm, I think, further east than you guys at this point. So it's nearly 11 p.m. So I've just got a few comments I'll make, sort of re-looking at some of the thoughts from my book. My book does not offer any historiographical, let alone a methodological kind of summary. But first, I wanted to say that my comments would be kind of like breaking down these three categories of global political and thought. And the thought bit is going to get short shrift today because of time, but to say that I have a very strong a priori commitment, which is quite unlike, say, Indian historiography, to say that actually ideas thought and concepts are really autonomous objects of historical inquiry and reconstruction. This is something that has kind of eluded in particularly South Asian, I'd like to prefer to call it the word Indian historiography. Though there is, of course, a very clear relationship between political economy and social and cultural history, but I think it is important to note that the study of India, which is seen arguably to be one of the most political places in the world, its politics has really been understood primarily as an empirics in social history or cultural history, as a kind of deferral from the West. So I think there is something to be accounted for why political thought or political ideas did not develop as a field in Indian historiography till much later. And here I think it's interesting to go back to the origins and go back to the 60s. So of course I sit in Cambridge between world history and political thought. I'm a subject group member of both very big groups in the faculty. The subject groups, they're not factions, they are like divisions in the faculty. But to say that it's Quentin Skinner's work has been kind of canonical in making this field. But it's really interesting that prior to Skinner, there were two landmark books written using India, making India the site of political ideas. One was, of course, Ranajit Guha's A Rule of Property for Bengal, written 5 years, I think, if not 6 years prior to any of Quentin Skinner's work. At the same time, a landmark book from Cambridge by Eric Stokes on English utilitarians and India. I think it's an unsurpassed book in my view. Both books remain unsurpassed for various reasons. But it's really interesting that while in Cambridge itself, but also political thought became a field to precisely overturn the instrumental name your right understandings of politics. That is the turn that actually Indian history takes on the one side, but it also takes a very sharp turn towards social history and history from below. All these things are great. I'm not kind of disputing them. I'm just kind of saying that's the trajectory of what has happened to the historiography. And it's really in really the 90s, the mid to late 90s, which is really my immediate inheritance as a graduate student, that really ideas do emerge again as objects of inquiry, but via cultural history and post-colonial theory particularly. And here I think, provincializing Europe is known as a word, book. It's an iconic intervention. It is illustrative of that problem, also not problematic really, of really the culture ideas problem, but also what Europe and India might stand in relation to each other, precisely in the question of on the question of concepts. And of course, this was not down to Chakrabarti, but of course, at that point, thanks also to Said and other ways of Foucault, the kind of very kind of unrecognizable ghosts of both those figures, gave a kind of a very strong turn towards what is discourse analysis and the history of knowledge epistemics in relation to empire and the like. Now, those are very big debates. But two things to notice. One, that liberalism and empire remained the predominant category to understand the flow, transaction. It remained preeminent right up to even Bailey's last book on India, Recovering Liberties. I mean, I depart from all of this, but not because I dismiss it, but because I think these are really all very, very important interventions. But they also, I wouldn't say left me dissatisfied, but I thought I had some other concerns that I was interested in, i.e. looking at ideas in terms of as real objects of reconstruction, historical reconstruction and interpretation, but also to deposit a kind of conceptual and reflective capacity to Indian politics, that it was not a series of simply mobilizations or social history groups or politics of interests and the like, or the intentions of elites, and those were the kind of questions. So that's really a kind of historiographical, kind of very short sketch to say that that's really where the book comes from. In terms of India itself, I think India is interesting, not because I'm an Indian historian, but India really has been at the center of, also at the same time, while towards the end of sort of the beginning of the 20th century, 21st century, India was also the preeminent site for an incitement to world history syntheses. So if, for instance, China in Ken Pomeranz's work offered the example of divergence of modernity, and the question of India then became the preeminent example through which convergence and globalization was understood. Again, birth of the modern world would be one, but there are others particularly on political economy. And to me, India really represents a miniature form of the global. I mean, its scale is a miniature form of the global, but it is also something, its diversity in some ways, its social, religious, linguistic diversity is in some ways much more, I don't want to sort of say it in a narcissistic, it's much more complex than the story of Europe. And therefore it's a very challenging place to actually put a story of convergence. And so it was kind of really counterintuitive for me to read those syntheses of world history in which India kind of, offered convergence. To me, it has always offered distinction, conflict, antagonism, agonism. And so I think there was an unease that I have always had with world history as a large synthetic project over time and over place. So my interest was really, and I wanted to say that in the conclusion, but I will say it here and then say a few things about the global, was to really, if for Chakrabarti, Europe was not just a place, but it was a set of norms, but it conveyed, it was a powerful name which conveyed norms, then I think my invitation or provocation in the book is that India now offers a kind of potential norm for global politics and the like. So I remain unclear whether India is an enlarged particularity. It is a very enlarged particularity writ on the world, or is it a sign of a reduced universal? That actually in this time of universality being questioned, can we actually kind of think about scales in that manner and not simply in terms of what has happened in historiography? And here, I don't need to tell this audience, but let me just say that the global, which is something that I am absolutely completely unconvinced about, the global is not the oppositional category to the national. So the national has been the kind of, the thing that has been, seen to be something that has to be transcended, has been undone by the so-called global turn, in which networks, connections, disruptions, traffic can be, and that's fine. I mean, these are pretty rich debates and they are very useful debates, and I'm pretty agnostic. I don't particularly have a legislative impulse in me to say, well, this is the way forward for any work. But the questions I was interested in, all these methods were not sufficient, let alone insightful for my work. So to me, in fact, the global, to me, seemed kind of a category of which is freighted not with spatiality or transcendence of kind of physical scale or even time, but really a kind of abstract. It is a complete act. It's something which is and has a kind of potentially destructive quality about it. So here I borrow from Jean-Luc Nancy's difference between the global planet on one side and the world on the other, where the world, the category of the world is seen to be something which is human, marked by human agency, and something, the planetary and the global was something inhuman, almost pretty abstract, with the potential to destruct. So one example would be world history capitalism could belong to the language of world, which is human, driven by human agency, but something called capital could be possibly a sign of something destructive. These are his examples. So I think I was precisely because, secondly, for me, I think the global represents the 20th century and a particular disposition to time. rather than something which is an endless scale of time, which is to say that the 20th century is a special century because it has a very particular subjective identity of time, which is marked by the confrontation and annihilation of the past. To use it's a Nietzschean century. Every society is appraising the past. And above all, it has a kind of futurity written into it. And most of my political thinkers are entirely future-oriented, even in which, in fact, even the empire has been circumvented, even though they are at that point in a colonial context. So I was interested in this question of confrontation of the past, the idea of scission, combat, and the kind of fetishization, if I can use the word, of futurity itself, the occupation of time horizon as that. And so I think in terms of time and in terms of scale, this is what these were my two kind of ways into thinking about the global. Finally, I would say something about what I was trying to do with the political. It was not really the idealized normative notions of, say, national or international order, which of course deserve their own treatment. Again, nothing is being dismissed here. But really, I was interested, and I think that to me offers some really important ways in, is a remaking of fundamental political concepts from the inside out. So of course, if we accept that there are certain modern political languages are universal in terms of democracy, sovereignty, and the like, they obviously don't look the same everywhere. So I was interested in working them from the inside out, and the work was really both about reconstruction of those ideas and interpretation, but above all, putting them in a field of interlocution, which was global, which is to say that if you put someone like, I don't do it openly or to kind of explicitly, but you can see a range of my interventions or these figures that I interpret, the kind of formative Indian political figures, in a range of 20th century political thinking, whether it's Hannah Arendt, Carl Schmitt, you can think of any number of the figures who have really remade what the political might stand for. So in that sense, I think I jettisoned, not because liberalism is not important, but actually to say that precisely because I'm a historian, that actually in the 20th century, liberalism had not just run its course in India, but it had been circumvented and destroyed even by the massive anti-colonial struggle. So India is instructive for me, not also because it is the first country to be decolonized from the British Empire after America. So it also offers instruction on anti-colonial political thinking and how actually questions of what are elsewhere called multiculturalism, but what I would call in India the creation of an agonistic democracy, are actually, you could argue that the future of Europe has perhaps happened in India. It's a provocation, it's an invitation, it's not a strong claim, but this is the way I have kind of, it's in a way to say that history of political thought, or the kind of what I'm interested in, it would necessarily be retroactive, a retroactive exercise rather than anything else. So I think in a way, so resistance may have been very prominent, it's really back alive again, and though it is written into my work, my concern really is with the remaking of political concepts which are deployed, why the futurity matters and why I think the political is not placeless, is because political ideas, unlike capital, need domestication, need settlement, need a place. So I would, these are my kind of thoughts on it, and to actually then finally say that in terms of the political, what emerges, and I think why the normative, so why not just resistance, but a bit like what Moyen has done with his work on, the latest work on Humane, on the war, is that really I'm interested in the creation of new norms, new political contexts, rather than simply how things have been undone dialogically or non-dialogically or resisted All those things are incredibly important, but I'm interested in, so in a way, if I can, I don't mean to be controversial at all, but to actually say this is the non-subaltern reading of politics. It looks at the kind of really the powerful, the most influential, the most effective, the most consequential. And one of the key arguments, and I'll conclude here, is that actually from the story of India, the instruction remains that the state, unlike say Skinner's work and Cambridge Political Thought's work, the state was the preeminent actor and the destination of modern politics. And that is really, really not the story that India tells. And yet it produces the world's largest, most diverse, and with the largest affirmative action program in the world, the largest democracy. So I think, I'll conclude here. The global, therefore, is not the opposite of the national. It is not simply a transcendence of time or physical scale, but it would be a disposition and an abstraction of concepts for me. So. And therefore, the debate now ought to be, in my view, one of the debates ought to be, what is the status of universal claims? What is the new universal? And I would say India offers potentially a new universal. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that invitation and several provocations, Professor. Professor Armitage, would you like to carry on the discussion on the roundtable?
Follow that act, as they used to say in the music hall. As will become very clear in my remarks, I'm not going to reflect on my own practice so much as Shruti's just done so brilliantly. And much of what I will say will be, as it were, footnotes to Shruti's night thoughts from India. Thank you for joining us so late, but as always, so illuminatingly, even in the dark, Shruti. I want to do what Shruti said at the beginning that she was not going to do, that is to reflect on methodology and also to survey the field or the waves of global political thought and how it's been studied over the last decade in a more structural and therefore somewhat abstract fashion. Though, as you'll see in the next 10 minutes, a lot of what I have to say does mesh very precisely with what Shruti said, and indeed draws upon her recent book and reflections upon it, including those that we've just heard. Now, the question with which the three of us were presented today was, what is the global in global political thought? I take it, even though this question comes from Ning and Hansung, who are formally at least students of political theory, that this is a question about history rather than a question about theory. I take it that the term thought in global political thought is the past tense of theory and theorizing here. So I'm going to talk from my perch as an historian, but I'm not going to deny myself the pleasure of hedging into or edging into even the normative here. And I'll end my remarks about what I think global political thought as a field could be and perhaps even should be as well. So I'm going to make three very brief sets of rather aphoristic remarks about what the global in global political thought looked like it was going to be when that question was first being asked about a decade ago, and Shruti and I were both, as it were, present at the creation for that around 2010. Then secondly, about what it seems to me at the moment global political thought is, what it is doing, what it has been doing cumulatively up to the horizon of our near present, where we sit now. And then a little more reflectively, the third part of my aphoristic remarks will be, again, what global political thought could or should be in the future. So let's go back to that far, far distant era a decade ago, around 2010, dear dead days beyond recall, when the first groups of historians and political theorists, most from within intellectual history, but increasing numbers at that point from within global history, taking ideas seriously, convened together to ask a version of exactly the question we're being asked today. What is the global in global political thought? What might global intellectual history be? For the moment, I'm going to collapse the distinction between GIH, global intellectual history, and GPT, global political thought. I'm not sure much hangs on that for this particular discussion, though that may come up. So a decade ago, when these very productive, very fertile, extremely stimulating discussions first began about global intellectual history or global political thought, I think there were three possibilities, maybe more, but there's three most important possibilities floated at that time about what this field might become or what it might cover or what its subject matter might be with these. The first was that it might be the history of various kinds of universalisms of different kinds. And I put it in those very broad terms. That was because that was often a slogan at the time. Competing universalisms was a particularly useful slogan that various colleagues used at that point. And it opened up the possibility of writing global intellectual histories and global histories of political thought, which were not simply concentrated on the 20th century. I think Shruti's already raised that very important question about the chronological boundaries. We can certainly discuss her challenging idea that global political thought is something which happens specifically in the 20th century because of this forward-looking and backward-looking Nietzschean and projective sense to that. But when talking about global political thought as the history of various universalisms, it allowed for the possibility, and indeed the actuality in practice, of dealing with various other even non-political universalisms in that period, including, of course, religious universalisms, going back even to the axial age in some of those very early discussions a decade ago. But it expanded the temporal boundaries of the study of global political thought, but it also concentrated on this idea of universality, the universal, and universalism. And I'll come back to that in a second, because I think that part of the project has really dropped away, as it were, like the launch rocket stage of a space mission, that we tend not to talk about universals in the same way. We're now into much more nuanced discussion, as Shruti's already hinted, about universal particularities or particularized universalities. And I think this is a much more precise, historicizable way to go. So first of all, the global was going to be about the universal, universality, universalisms. It was also projected at that point, again, we're around 2010, that at least one of the focuses of global intellectual history would be the history of globality itself. Conceptions of the global, conceptions of globality, how those had developed across time and within different locations around the globe itself. I think too that agenda has rather dropped away, that it was found not to yield a great deal of conceptual meat, which could be drawn upon in later discussions. So some of the early enthusiasm for recovering conceptions of the global and globality, perhaps as a kind of means of limiting the scope of global political thought by aligning, as it were, the emic and the etic. How did people in the past think about supranational, super-regional, inter-regional, planetary scale, worldwide connections, events, conceptions? That too has somewhat dropped out of the conversation. Maybe it needs to come back in again, but to concentrate global political thought on the history of the global as a political category, and indeed as other kinds of category of community, let's say, that some of the steam seems to have gone out of that project as well, for reasons that I think are justifiable, but we might want to rethink whether there's still something to be recovered from that. And the third, again, this is very schematic, it's not exhaustive. I think the third, and perhaps the most banal, the most basic, was that global political thought should be the history of non-Western political thought, or to put that a tiny bit more sharply, that it should be the history of political thinking, which was non-Eurotropic. And I put it in those terms not to avoid the debates about Eurocentrism, but I will always find it more useful to think about Eurotropism. That is an inclination towards the Euro, and of course the Euro meaning the Mediterranean Atlantic complex from the 15th century onwards in a global context, but to think about forms of political thinking which did not necessarily subtend or tend towards or pretend to or have some connection with that Euro-Atlantic assemblage. And so histories of political thought which did not include or escaped beyond or were rooted in regions outside that Euro-Atlantic complex seemed to be becoming at least a major agenda, again, around about 2010. And there was a point, and I say this slightly facetiously, but also a little bit challengingly, and I suspect that Shruti might agree with me on this, there was a point when it seemed that global intellectual history was going to be a synonym for South Asian intellectual history, for very productive ways, because it was the South Asianists, not least Shruti herself, commanding groups of scholars, bringing together agendas and creating special issues, edited volumes, collective activities, which foregrounded South Asian political thought precisely as a seedbed for models for this non-Eurotropic history of political thought, which could be exported to other parts of the world as well. So I say that facetiously because they were just the first out of the gate, the most productive, the best organized, and for reasons that Shruti's already told us, there may be reasons indeed why South Asia itself, India in particular, can become a synecdoche for global political thought per se, and I'm sure we'll return to that in discussion. So that's where we were a decade ago, let's say. Where are we now? Again, very briefly. Now the global is the history of political thought around non-Western categories or around categories of the political, in a very, very broad sense, generated outside the Euro-Atlantic assemblage. And Shruti's book, what she's just told us arising from her reflection on that book, I think is exemplary for exactly this, to rethink the very notion of the political, thinking of it as thought, that is something that can be historicized and must be historicized, but in categories which can be global because they escape that Euro-Atlantic assemblage. It's also, global political thought, I think now is more generally, more broadly in the field, the history of all kinds of supranational political thinking. And I use that deliberately vague term, not to collapse back into that antinomy of the national versus the global, which Shruti's already warned us about falling into, but to point us towards the various kinds of connective, distributive, agonistic forms of political thinking, which cross the conventional boundaries, the conventional containers within which intellectual history and the history of political thought has been contained. However, and often, of course, South-South connections being front and center within that, rather than South-North, or again, any kinds of Eurotropic or Euro-Atlantic centered or Euro-Atlantic tropic forms. However, I think it would be fair to say, for the moment, because we're still in the midst of this grand enterprise, the global political thought, like the future in William Gibson's famous formulation, global political thought is still as yet unevenly distributed in terms of its regional focuses. It's one reason I'm particularly pleased, one of many reasons I'm particularly pleased that Josh Simon is joining this discussion here, because I think it's been observable over the decade-long course of global political thought / global intellectual history that Latin America has not been as prominent in these discussions as it should be. So I'm very much on the edge of my seat to hear what Josh will say in just a moment. So I don't want to ramble on for too long, so I'll rush to my concluding thoughts about what global political thought could or should be in the future. And this will be partly picking up on things that Shruti's already flagged, but adding a couple of other elements as well. The first thing I was going to say, Shruti has already flagged this, but I want to accentuate it, is that the global is not just a geographical category. It is a temporal category. The global, I'll say this aphoristically, the global, like say enlightenment, is a temporal category. And a temporal category which is more about the future than it is about the present or the past. And therefore that histories of the future, future-oriented histories, histories of future-related and future-directed thinking are central to the forms of the global. And we can find those not just in the 20th century. I think Shruti's right, it's that collision or collapsing of the historicizing and the future-oriented, which is perhaps typical of the 20th century, but we can go back at least to the late 18th century for these future-oriented conceptions, many of which I think of Mary Wollstonecraft, for instance, just as somebody I've been talking about in these terms lately, who thinks in global terms. who thinks on enormous timescales and thinks about the global articulated with the future, for instance. So I think we must think about the global as a temporal category, a category of temporality rather than just one of spatiality, in order to break some of the conventional boundaries. Most histories of political thought have not theorized the temporal, and in particular the future, as part of the temporal, though there's very good work by Duncan Bell and others which is really opening up this area, and it is centrally part, I think indeed a definitive part, of what global political thought is and what it should be as a field. So from the temporal, the second, I would say this also has to be material. Shruti has very importantly said that for certain parts of the world, particularly for India, the concentration on ideas as autonomous objects has lagged behind, but has been crucial now, being shown to be crucial to any historical consideration of those regions. I think the next stage, though, is to add the material to the ideal. We need to be taking lessons, for instance, from some of the best work in intellectual sociology to ask questions about not just how do ideas travel, but in what material forms do they travel? Who are the agents who circulate them? What are the consequences of their physical circulation, so that we can get a concrete material sense both of the circuits and the forms, the physical and material forms within which ideas travel. We're long past Lovejovian Platonism about the ideas of about the notion of ideas themselves inhabiting some empyrean realm far above the human. We have to think about the concrete material ways in which ideas move across borders and within borders of an area like India, for instance. So we can't just concentrate on the ideal. We have to integrate the material with that as well, of course, taking lessons from global historians who have been moving very far and very fast and very deep in reconstructing those material connections. My penultimate point also relates to quite current movements within global history itself that we can bring into global political thought and global intellectual history. That is, we should not assume as a default that anything that has the word global in it is necessarily a history of connection. Much of the most productive work that's on the horizon in global history is precisely about disconnection, the barriers to flows, the ways in which networks are not just made up of the strings, as it were, of the nets, but also the holes. What are the resistances and the barriers to circulation, to movement? What are the blockages and the impediments? Where are the ruptures and the disruptions within the global as well? That too is part of the history of the global, detaching, as global history for a while seemed to be the history of globalization with an inbuilt but largely unquestioned teleology. Now that we're exposing that and thinking about disconnection as part of global history, I think we need to theorize and also practically concentrate on that. And then the last point, Shruti's already mentioned Dipesh Chakrabarty's work on provincializing Europe. I would bring in now, along the lines of what she was saying about Jean-Luc Nancy as well, Dipesh's most recent work on the category of the planetary as well as the global. That is, global political thought cannot simply be thinking by humans about humans. It has to be about thinking about humans about the non-human, and we have to find ways to integrate the non-human, their actions and activity, even what might be inferred about their forms of thinking, into global political thought. So we might come back perhaps in 10 years or sooner to a forum like this and ask ourselves, what is the planetary in planetary political thought? And I think that will turn out to be something rather different from the global in global political thought. But thank you so much, Ning, for this opportunity. I greatly look forward to Josh's remarks now as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Armitage. I shall put that in my calendar 10 years from now. I will be sure to invite everybody back. Professor Simon, would you like to proceed with the comments?
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I should begin by confessing that I'm honored to be here, and I felt some apprehension actually in accepting the invitation and in preparing my remarks, specifically because I'm worried that following these very distinguished co-panelists, there's very little that I'll be able to say that won't amount to just repeating what they've said or to cribbing from their excellent work. But I take some solace in my disciplinary isolation on this panel as a lone political theorist amongst historians. And I hope that speaking as a political theorist, I can offer a slightly different perspective on global political thought, if not a different conception of global political thought. So the first observation I can make from this perspective is that, as far as I can tell, global political thought is not really a widely acknowledged subject matter of interest amongst political theorists. It's not to say that political theorists aren't interested in what we've been calling global political thought, but when they talk about it, they tend to use two distinct but related terms. The first being international political theory, and the second being comparative political theory. So I think this distinction is of something more than semantic import. The fact that these pursuits are usually labeled international political theory and comparative political theory rather than international and comparative political thought is not a consequence of completely conscious choices, but it does reflect a difference in how practitioners understand the purpose of their activities, what we might call the why rather than the what or the how of the field. And that's a point I want to come back to in just a moment. First, let me try to briefly define each field. So I understand international political theory to mean systematic reflection on actual and ideal patterns of interaction between individuals, groups of individuals, institutionalized groups of individuals like corporations, states, empires, international institutions, non-governmental organizations, interactions in contexts that are ungoverned or at least not well governed by domestic or municipal laws. So embarrassingly, I have to admit that definition is basically a paraphrase of David Armitage. So I've already failed to avoid cribbing my co-panelists, but I will press on. So practitioners of international political theory are concerned both to read, understand, and assess previous, that is to say, historical reflections on international politics, and to add their own original reflections to the pile. Comparative political theory, in contrast, describes a field concerned to interpret and analyze reflections on politics, whether international or domestic, that were composed by authors who lived and worked outside of Western Europe and North America. So if international political theory is distinguished from political theory simpliciter by its subject matter, comparative political theory is distinguished by the geographic location or origins of the theorists that it examines. In this sense, it's a field much more oriented to interpretive and explanatory projects, and to the extent that comparative political theorists seek to add their own original reflections on politics, they're typically reflections on the problems that arise in our efforts to select and to read and to assess texts, or on the question of what where we are political theorists that live in Western Europe or North America can hope to learn from the text that we're studying. So having defined these fields of international and comparative political theory as well as I can, what I want to do with the time that I have left is to argue that the global in global political thought, if it's to become a subject of interest to political theorists, should really locate itself at the intersection of international and comparative political theory. That's to say, global political thought should pay particular attention to systematic reflections on international politics that were composed by theorists who lived or were born outside of Western Europe and North America. So why should we focus our studies in this way? That brings me back to the observation I made a minute ago concerning the import of labeling our fields international and comparative political theory rather than thought. I think that again, though not always consciously, that term theory is preferred here because as political theorists, we view, or we would like to view, the thoughts, ideas, and arguments and claims, these theories in short, that we formulate and study as susceptible to confirmation or disconfirmation, whether analytic or empirical, or sometimes both analytic and empirical. That is, political theorists approach the ideas they study with something more or something else than what a critic of Quentin Skinner called a dusty antiquarian interest. We are not satisfied, and some of us are not even particularly concerned to get the ideas we're studying right, in the sense of describing for our readers the meaning of the text and what the author of the text meant to do in writing them. Rather, we're concerned to know whether our own ideas or the ideas we study are right, meaning variously logically consistent or correspondent to reality or simply compelling in some other sense of the term. So it's in view of this end that I think the intersection of international political theory and comparative political theory is a particularly promising field to cultivate. To be specific, I think there are two ways in which studying reflections on international politics composed by authors who lived and worked outside of Western Europe and North America can help us improve how we think about international politics. The first is well described actually by Quentin Skinner in his reply to the critics I mentioned, who claimed that his approach left the study of the history of political thought bereft of anything but the dustiest antiquarian interests. Skinner argued that the studying classic texts in the history of political thought, and specifically studying them with an eye to understanding what their authors intended to do when they wrote them, can reveal not the essential sameness, but rather the variety of viable moral assumptions and political commitments. That is, they can show the extent to which those features of our own arrangements, which we may be disposed to accept as timeless truths, may be little more than contingencies of our local history and social structure. So an encounter with a theorist whose reflections on politics depart from first principles different from one's own, employ a language and a set of concepts different from one's own, and perhaps reach conclusions different from one's own, can loosen the constraints placed upon one's thinking by the first principles, concepts, and conclusions that one has, for the most part, unwittingly adopted and accepted as a fish accepts the water that it swims in. And so that this destabilizing, sort of deconstructive purpose can be accomplished not only by encounters with texts written long ago, but also by texts written far away, by authors situated in distinct linguistic and religious and philosophical contexts, should, I think, be clear. And moreover, I think this project is all the more urgent when it's framed by reference to the study of non-Western European and non-North American reflections on international politics than it is when it's framed, as it was by Skinner, in reference to the classic texts of the history of municipal political thought. So that the constraints on our reflections on international politics are and have been particularly limiting is clear from the ease with which our, and again by our I mean Western European and North American theorists of international politics, have assumed that people outside Western Europe and North America, when people outside Western Europe and North America think differently about international politics, this reflects a deficit or a developmental delay on their part, and proceeded to argue from that assumption that this deficit or delay should be remedied by tutelage imposed by one or another form of imperial rule. So if global political thought can shake the provincial hubris that animates imperial ideologies, it will be a very worthwhile endeavor indeed. However, at the same time, I want to suggest that this deconstructive form of critique does not exhaust the potential of studying the intersection of international and comparative political theory, and that indeed it may even leave something to be desired if we want to do more than just destabilize our assumptions. That is, if we want to explore the possibility that we might actually be convinced to revise our views on international politics by adopting the views expressed in the text that we study. And to see this, we need only note that the distinctiveness of reflections on international politics composed by theorists who live and work outside of Western Europe and North America is not only a product of the distinct assumptions, languages, and concepts that they bring to bear. So my own research interest in Latin American political thought, I find an intellectual tradition conducted for the most part in European languages, employs concepts familiar from the history of European political thought, but it is nonetheless distinctive. And as I've tried to show, the distinctiveness of Latin American political thought derives in large part from the distinctive political and institutional context within which its theorists lived and worked, rather than from the linguistic or intellectual context that they shared with European and North American counterparts. So this kind of setting in which languages and concepts develop to think about politics in one context are modified to address problems that arise or that become visible in a different, become problematic in a different context, produces a different kind of critical argument. What I'm in my current work, working on as immanent critique. So immanent critique highlights systematic failure of institutions, practices, or forms of life to perform the task they were designed and adopted to perform. It offers a positive, a reconstructive account of how such institutions and practices could be improved so as to better perform the tasks that their architects have already agreed should be performed. In that sense, because it's already been agreed that these tasks should be performed, it can not only loosen the limits of our own worldview, but actually convince us, employing the force of the better argument, as Habermas put it, to adopt a better alternative. So in the present state of international politics, where empire has been and in important respects remains our way of life, this kind of critique, immanent critique, I think is particularly important. And his recent work by scholars like Arnulf Beckler-Lorca, Adam Getachew, Jamil Aden, Gary Wilder, and others has shown us compelling immanent critiques addressed to international law and to international politics are prominent not only within Latin American political thought, but also in African political thought, South Asian political thought, East Asian political thought as well. So by situating global political thought at this intersection of international political theory and comparative political theory, I'm confident and hopeful that we can find more and perhaps even more compelling immanent critiques of this kind. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon. So we are now just at the 1 p.m. or not time zones, but we are at the 1 hour mark. And I would like to invite our three speakers to respond to one another for a few minutes, perhaps until about 10 past the hour, at which point we can open the floor up to discussion. Yes, Professor Kapila.
So thank you both very much. And it's great to hear Josh Simons for the first time. I actually had a question for you, Josh, in some ways that I mean, I have full agreement with the project and the like, but I was wondering, why is this not simply post-colonial theory? Or, why does it need global political, why does it need some other label? Because this work that you describe has a very long pedigree of thinking now under post-colonial theory, which is precisely about the struggle of categories between empire, resistance, and other places, right? I mean, so that was really my question. And I have something to say about comparative political theory a little bit, because of course, a lot of my, not colleagues, but people in the field are doing that. And so I mean, and I'm always struck by a kind of parallel between that and what kind of David had described in terms of, exchange, traffic, connections, you're kind of measuring things in some ways, in terms of one, and I was actually, while I think it's really worthwhile, I mean, as I said, no legislative, impulse on me, but I find it, I'll say why I'm less satisfied with that approach is because I think it still speaks to the non-West as a derived category. It's a derivative. It's a comparative is kind of not synonymous, but kind of it's kind of neighbors with the derivativeness. And I think I would be interested more in the generative potential of place. And that's precisely why I say, they might look the same. They might be using precisely the same terms like liberty, fraternity, republicanism, the rest. What has happened inside those categories is kind of completely unfamiliar to say what may have come out from the French revolutionary tradition or what have you. So I was just those two questions: why not just post-colonial theory, and why not generative as opposed to comparative?
Professor Simon?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. That's it's really challenging. Why not just call it post-colonial theory? Well, it's not, I mean, it's not specifically, I don't think what I've just described is specifically concerned with empire in particular, necessarily, right? It makes empire a central object of analysis, and the problem of empire in large part lends urgency to the project. But that doesn't, empire and the problem of the post-colony doesn't exhaust the potential insights to be derived from this field, I don't think. So again, the potential actors or objects of analysis within international political theory include empire, but also include individuals, also include corporations, also include international institutions. And while it's interesting to explore those activities with relation to empire, that isn't the only question that necessarily arises. And in fact, I think sometimes when empire is made so central as it is and should be in post-colonial political theory, it sometimes becomes constraining actually on the thinking that can be done, where we run into particularly this problem of what I've been calling lately imperial entanglement, where a critical argument consists of showing that some thought system or some institution shares some kind of origin, some kind of genealogy with empire, and then the argument is done when that's been demonstrated. What's crucial is to, I think, to press on beyond that, and even to explore cases in which empire can be generative of new ways of thinking about international politics, and not merely always a contaminant of our ways of thinking. So I'm interested to hear more about that, but I think it's a really interesting question. And does calling comparative political theory indicate a derivative quality? Well, that's kind of precisely what I was trying to get to a little bit with this account of two different ways in which comparative political theory, or specifically this intersection of comparative political theory and international political theory, can generate insight, which is to say, comparative political theory has been conceived of as a source precisely of non-derivative ways of thinking about politics, a source of original languages, indigenous languages of thinking about politics. And at times, I think, yes, this is where your critique is active, which is to say, the more that we rest the importance of studying these ideas on their totally autochthonous quality vis-a-vis European political thought, the more we have to kind of containerize ideas in a way that is illegitimate and problematic. But what I'm trying to find in Latin American political thought, which as I indicated, is not containerized in this way and can never be conceived of in that way, is precisely what you were saying, which is these appropriations and redeployments of categories that appear familiar and to reach conclusions which are deeply unfamiliar. And that to me is precisely this form of immanent critique in which I'm so interested. And this gets to a question I was going to pose to both of you, actually, which concerns this incorporation of the material into global political thought. And how that's conceived, because I think the way David put it, where material refers to the material forms in which ideas travel, is one way to conceive of that. But I think also to conceive of the material context within which ideas that have traveled are reappropriated and redeployed, and to distinguish that form of influence from just simply tracing the passage of ideas or the passage of containers of ideas as a crucial way of incorporating the material into global political thought. And that was what I took Shruti to be saying, in a sense, when she was speaking about the material and specifically about capitalism and how that structures this the global and global political thought. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for the questions.
Professors Armitage and Kapila, would you like to respond?
Yes, two very brief remarks. One, piggybacking on what Josh just said, very interesting exchange between Shruti and Josh there, and then one actually throwing it back to you, Yining. I want to bring your voice into this as well, if I may, just to warn you about that. So on the material, I was thinking, yes, exactly along the terms that Josh was talking about, but also thinking about, let's say, the interaction between questions like the translation of concepts or ideas or arguments from one context to another, literal translation, words shift and move when they go into different semantic fields, but also even something as basic as the repackaging, the literal repackaging of those ideas. Just one example that comes to mind in relation to Josh's work is that when, for instance, the founding documents of the United States are translated to Spanish, that's done in around 1810. They're repackaged along, for example, with extracts from Paine's Common Sense into a kind of handbook of revolution at the very origins of the Spanish-American revolutionary movements, which of course, as we now know very well, were not nationalist movements. They didn't have a nationalist state-based teleology, but just looking at one of those volumes and seeing what's packaged with what are the paratexts, what are the physical forms, how does that move physically from Philadelphia, where it's translated and printed, throughout the Spanish-American world, how the Spanish monarchy sets up resistances to that by banning its circulation. These are very important to know about how the ideas travel together with what, and then when they land, what happens to them is another set of equally interesting questions. And then the other point that I wanted to raise, or actually to ask as a question, Yining, is why did you and your co-conspirators decide that it was necessary to create an association for global political thought at this moment? And why did you think, as part of that enterprise, asking this question of us, what is the global in global political thought, was so immediately urgent? This because we have a particularly large group here today who may not have heard your opening spiels before about the association. It would be very interesting, I think, for all of us to hear why you thought, as a political theorist and other political theorists, thought this was the moment to focus our minds on global political thought.
Well, thank you for that invitation to come in with the spiel. The idea of setting up an association, well, the association is a rather formal and formalizing container for all of these discussions to take place in. But for the specific historical moment that we're in, I think there has been a particular cascading effect or coalition, or some might say critical mass, in various fields in political theory and intellectual history, in the history of political thought, and indeed in global history, that so many reflections have been made in the past 20 to 30 years, probably. So many reflections have been made on the idea of global and globalizing and globability, that I think this is a particularly fruitful moment for us to create a space where all of these discursive interventions can take place. And in particular, there is this, and Professor Simon has addressed this so very well, there's a spectral animating presence of comparative political theory, and more recently cosmopolitan and creolized political theory, or political thought, as the case may be, that I think a reflection on how the global operates as a signifier is really important, is something really important to reflect on. And I use the term signifier and not anything else to also point out the strategic question that, that scholars need to reflect on. I'm thinking specifically about comparative political theory and how all these discussions about what the field is has somehow not, well, a lot has been said within comparative political theory about how the point is not to reify the West and the non-West. The point is not to have two separate containers and treat them as though they're stable and stable ground for comparison. And yet something about the word comparative as a signifier continues to be rather sticky. And so to my mind, and I think the association is diverse enough that not everyone might agree, to my mind, global might have some potential to gain a sort of escape velocity, to recycle the space metaphor. That's my spiel. Professor Kapila?
No, thank you. I think that was fantastically clear, and so and much agreement. I actually just wanted to make a very quick point, referring to David's point on the material. Well, yes, capital has always been a kind of default understanding of the material. And I'm a bit cautious. I mean, I was only referring to Jean-Luc Nancy's thing there. I'm kind of more interested in the material, not in the book history, and all of that is incredibly important. And especially if you look at archives in India, I mean, this is a really live political question. Even some of the most important founding figures. It's just, I mean, appalling how their papers exist. But that's not what I'm referring to. For me, actually, what has animated the material is more the word concrete. I would use that metaphor, like what is concrete politics? Like really, like, what is, in a way, for instance, for me, so if in the book, it was more about how a kind of you can have the world's largest republic without republicanism as a cause of historical struggle, right? And that would be one, but I think increasingly, this is not, I see some of scholars sitting in the Zoom room, some of them might be interested in the debates around caste and race. These are now new, absolutely global categories. And whether we like Wilkerson's book or not, there's a huge debate about that book in South Asian historiography. But I think these are real life debates now around a new kind of universal concept, vocabulary. I mean, so universal vocabulary increasingly. And I think those for me would be what I think in terms of what the word material might be. I tend not to use that word, but more I tend to think in terms of concrete instantiations of, politics.
Thank you very much. A note that we are 1/4 past the hour, so I shall stop the recording here.